I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're glad to see so many of you today for a roundtable on the role of social policy in promoting human security in the MENA region, which is organized by both the HDCA thematic group Human Security and the MENA Social Policy Network. Firstly, the speakers will present their thoughts on this important topic for 10 minutes. Following the presentation, there will be approximately 30 minutes for discussion. Now, before I give the floor to Dr. Rana Jawad and Professor Des Gasper for a few introduction words on the MENA Social Policy Network and the HDCA thematic group, we would like to welcome our speakers. Firstly, we have with us Professor Des Gasper. He is a Professor Emeritus of Human Development, Development Ethics and Public Policy at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. This is a graduate school of international development studies, and he has written several studies on human security analysis. With us today, we also have Dr. Mahmoud Messkoub, who is actually a colleague of Dr. Des Gasper, and he is a senior research fellow at the same institute. He has authored various publications on social policy, poverty and employment policies, unpaid household work and cash transfers. And in the past, he has also acted as a consultant to, amongst others, UNESCO, ILO and the UNDESA. Further, we are joined by Dr. Wali Aslam, who is an associate professor in international relations at the University of Bath. His research focuses on international conflict and security studies, and he is also a co-investigator on the research project Social Protection and Sustainable Peace in the Middle East and North Africa region, building a new welfare-centered politics together with Dr. Rana Jawad, which is funded by the British government's Global Challenges Research Fund. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Nathalie Milbach Bouche, and I do pronounce Boucher, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. She is a strategic senior advisor at the regional hub of the United Nations Development Programme in Amman. She is a development economist with over 20 years of experience in policy advice, research and programmatic support on poverty and inequality, social protection, and also inclusive growth and sustainable development issues. Previously, she has managed the UNDP sub-regional facility for the Syria crisis and led UNDP's work on inclusive growth and the SDGs in the Arab region. We're honored to have such an esteemed panel with us, and I now would like to give the floor to Rana. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Tamara. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rana Jawad. I'm at the University of Bath, a senior lecturer in social policy and convener of the MENA Social Policy Network. So it's a real honor to have you with us. Let's increase the numbers and hopefully work together in establishing the next generation of social policy researchers focused on the MENA region. It's really great to collaborate with our colleagues at the HCDA as well. So thank you, Des and Tamara, for organizing this event. So I'm just going to briefly speak to you about the MENA Social Policy Network, just as a background to why social policy is important, especially for understanding the issues that the MENA region faces and potentially how we can move forward. Certainly, I think the COVID pandemic, as usual, as any crisis does, emphasizes yet again questions of social justice, social cohesion, and just really brings to the fore these two big interconnected concepts of prosperity and peace that all countries try to work towards, or at least in terms of their aspirations. So just sharing the screen here, if you're not already familiar with the network, then thank you for joining for the first time, and hopefully you'll find ways of connecting with us, and we can also facilitate your engagement. There's a lot of interesting information, and I believe the information specific to involvement is right at the end of the network website that you can see in front of you. There's a range of activities that we try to do, both in terms of encouraging research and research collaborations, but also in terms of sharing knowledge. So in that sense, the network tries to be just a neutral platform to share high quality critical research, and also where possible to share knowledge so that we can improve our learning overall, whether we're engaged as practitioners in policymaking, or whether we're in academia, or whether we are independent researchers. So we welcome your thoughts and we welcome your contributions. There are various ways that you can be more involved. You can tell us about what you're doing. You can try and link with other researchers. There are standard things like blogs that you could be involved in. And as you can see right at the top, there's all the tabs that can lead you to the various activities that we provide and try to facilitate. If you're a PhD graduate and you'd like to share more about your interesting research, we also run a series of essays, if you like, called Policy Innovation Case Studies, where we try to highlight innovations in problem solving related to social policy, specifically in the MENA region. But we also welcome comparative research and comparative insights, because often that's what's missing. And the MENA region, for a variety of historical and contemporary reasons, is a little bit of an outlier in the theoretical literature on social policy, and certainly in conflict prevention or conflict studies more broadly. There are ways in which this could be further updated. One big reason is because of the lack of data around MENA countries, and specifically Arab countries. The situation is improving, but that's why, of course, we need to keep our emphasis on encouraging research and sharing knowledge in a way that's relevant for policy. So yeah, please spread the word, take time to get involved, and stay tuned. We've got interesting projects that will hopefully we'll be talking more about, and hopefully a very good commissioning activity that we're hoping to start, where interested colleagues can also apply for grants to conduct research or to run seminars and knowledge exchange events. I'll just end, if I may, by going back to this idea of social policy, and just to emphasize the focus of the network around social policy and what it means. Perhaps this is my own understanding, but again, this is a concept that perhaps together we can develop, which is that clearly social policy has something to do with the provision of public services and social welfare. But perhaps that's the definition that tends to override other understandings of social policy that have to do with questions of political settlements and social cohesion. And so in that sense, I would say it's important for us as a group, and hopefully we can grow and expand these ideas, to think about how this idea of social policy is about a space between state and citizens, to hopefully openly discuss issues of rights and responsibilities and accountability, and that actually the policy process itself is a political act. Yeah, basic questions about what services are available, how citizens find out about their eligibility to apply for services, how they might complain about a service that doesn't work well for them. All of these are basic building blocks of a political system that's accountable and that hopefully responds to social rights. And because of this deep connection to questions of social cohesion, I think the link to conflict prevention and human security that we're making today is just absolutely so timely. And I really want to thank Des and all our colleagues at ISS and Tamara for making this possible. And certainly to welcome our colleagues from Bath, so Wali Aslam, for example, for being involved, because it seems that there are intuitive connections in thinking about the question of security, not just in the traditional terms of access to services and redistribution, but also about how community level grievances and how questions of social exclusion or inequality can also exacerbate lack of access to services and exclusion from the political process. Yeah, so hopefully these connections we can begin to discuss today, and I look forward to developing these ideas with you all. Thank you so much.
Des, may I invite you to briefly introduce the HDCA and to kick off the presentations as part of the panel?
Thanks, Tamara. Thanks, everybody. Tamara and I help run a theme group on human security in the Human Development and Capability Association. It's a newish group, began 2 years ago. But the HDCA itself is about 20 years old and is quite a large international research network and association, which has many theme groups, annual conferences, connection to the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, working relationships with UNDP. So the HDCA is a fairly big operation. It had a conference in Amman at one stage, I think around 2010. And currently, like everyone, we have shifted to lots of online events. And our theme group is very pleased to participate with you in this event, which we hope also is part of continuing sharing of and developing of ideas. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. It's based on a presentation to the opening meeting of our theme group, but I've updated it and tried to link it to today's agenda. The Arab Human Development Report 2009, which UNDP sponsors its global annual human development report, and the 1994 such report was launching the idea of human security, at least the UNDP modern version of that idea. And in 2009, one of the series of Arab human development reports took up human security as its theme, and is, at the time, I thought was a very interesting, worthwhile report. I'd be interested to hear from people how far it still has any recognition or relevance 12 years later. The current version of human security in UN terms, so we can call this one of the UN policy languages, like human development, like human rights, trying to, in each case, humanize, focus on people, a concept, or a major global concept, development, rights, security. And as a partner to the others, so not coincidentally, the launcher of the UNDP expression of the human security idea was Mahbub Haq, headed the Human Development Report Office, launched also the idea of human development. And then working in the UN through the 90s, early and mid-90s, Haq saw the need to complement his human development concept with a concept of human security, to humanize security discussions, focus them on people, and also the implications for national security of neglecting people, and to enrich the human development discussion by a more dynamic attention to risks, threats, forces of disruption and destruction. You could describe this, in fact, let me go to a further screen, as whereas the human development work was explicitly centered on capability, ability to fulfill well-reasoned values. So what can people do of value in their life, and to center development thinking on that. Human security analysis adds focus on vulnerability of people. In the same way, you can also see the complementarity between human rights thinking and human security thinking. Human security thinking stresses the systems of interconnection that may produce threats and risks as well as opportunities, and which affect the achievement of the values, the priorities, the requisites for human dignity stressed under the human rights banner. And one can trace how, in fact, already from in the 1940s, and it's there in the language of the UN Charter and freedom from fear, freedom from want, etc., that the UN's rationale has always involved joint attention to development and rights and peace and security. So that partnership is intrinsic to why people need the United Nations. The 1994 Human Development Report was a first step, one can say, but it's had surprising amount of continuing use because it gives a broad picture of a basic sort of checklist of areas of people's lives where attention is needed and the language of security as a prioritizing language is relevant beyond only fields of national and military security and avoidance of violence or exercise of violence. The list that was provided in that 1994 report is very rough and ready and incomplete and overlapping, and but it proved relatively serviceable, at least in many studies, as an initial agenda for attention, for comparison, for looking for linkages. And for example, the Arab Human Development Report 2009 also more or less followed it. In elaboration of the ideas of human security, ideas about systems of structural disadvantage, structural vulnerability, structural violence have been important and more elaborated. And the best example I know of this is in this book by Dorothy Estrada Tunk, showing why human rights law has increasingly connected to human security arguments about how societal systems affect individuals, and the individualistic, or more narrowly individualistic focus of traditional human rights analysis, not all human rights analysis, but much as exercised in courts, deciding who did what harm to what other person, whereas one needs to consider also how broader societal systems, not just individual acts, isolated individual acts, may cause harm, basic harm to vulnerable people. So that's stressing two types of interconnection. There's the interconnection of threats, one thing leading to another, and it's the interconnectedness of people. And within human security thinking, quite influential is the idea of common security, that one group cannot be sustainably secure while other groups that it lives with are insecure. And even in grander language, term of community of fate, originally I think a French concept. And connecting then to the rationale for public goods at various levels, local, national, global. So that's the sort of origin of current human security language within the UN system and in relationship to human development and human rights. Now I want to say something about content. I'll have to be very brief. One can see there's this concept of security of the basic requirements of ordinary people. And then that has been built on and worked with and added to give what we can call an analytical perspective or frame, of which there are various versions, and leading out of that, various applications in policy planning and governance. A lot of it, we could say, is at the level of policy philosophy. So it's broad principles, it's ideas about empowerment and protection is so not only protecting people, but empowering them. This is a study from GPAC, a peace-building global network which uses human security ideas quite a lot. Ideas of precaution, ideas of common security, ideas of the complementarity of peace development and human rights, as I mentioned. So a lot of this is at the level, we could say, of a broadly motivating, orienting policy philosophy. But there's also considerable work at the level of particular tools. Some of that is new work, so say on human security indices. Some of it is, most of it is connecting to existing relevant other work, such as in scenarios analysis. It's not a tight package of procedures and so on. It's a family of constructs which are used by various organizations, groups in various ways. So here in the Arab Human Development Report, it had its own definition of the concept, the objective, and its own sort of version of a fuller perspective. And there are various sort of specifications of what may exactly be included in the concept and then in the broader perspective. Here's one from the Routledge Handbook of Human Security. Amartya Sen was a co-founder of the concept, working with Huck, and some of this is a norm, the focus on people, focus on basic needs fulfillment, and some of this is within the analytical perspective of seeing lives in societal and environmental systems and as exposed to threats that can connect, that can produce disruptive downward spirals. And there are various other expositions, but I think it's helpful to distinguish between the concept or norm and the analytical frame, and then beyond that, the sort of policy philosophy. Here, something sort of at the intersection of analytical frame and policy philosophy, because it's not very sharp policy analysis framework, but it's a checklist of basic security questions, which with my colleague Oscar Gomez, we did in what is, I think, still the Human Development Report's Office guidance note on a human security study. So a basic checklist about, well, whose security is everybody, which is not an innocuous, not a banal question, because in many cases, some groups are omitted and downgraded. So it's everybody's security, and then there are issues of what are basic needs, what are priorities in the particular context, against which threats, who is to respond, using what instruments and with what target levels and normic thresholds. And fundamental is, and who decides, or whose perception of values and threats and priorities is determinant. And we use this a bit in that guidance note and also in some recent work. Since the 1994 Human Development Report, there's been lots and lots of work in various areas which calls itself human security related. Lots of it is connected to armed conflict, or so-called, in the 1994 language, personal security. In other words, it's about crime, it's about violence, not necessarily in wars or civil wars, but still violence-centered or crime-centered. And that's prominent here in the Routledge Handbook. But there's lots of other work of significance, cumulative, interesting in other areas. And the approach has also evolved to get beyond just those boxes which were listed in the 1994 report to think about how priorities may be situation specific and are also partly how they are perceived, how they link to people's culture is variable. And so the work has evolved beyond that list of 7 boxes from 1994. Within the personal security box, though that's a very big one, and lots of work, especially in Latin America, that now uses the title citizen security, working on crime and violence, and quite interesting because there's a recurrent massive disparity between perceived threat and measured threat. And that may be because then the measurements are wrong, or it may be because the perceptions are unbalanced, but it certainly generates very interesting research agendas and work in many other areas, disasters, climate change, migration, and gender. Quite a few gender scholars found the formulations around structural vulnerability, multiple interacting forms of insecurity within human security literature, a good tool, a good way of looking at lives of women, and similarly for other marginal groups. And here's an example. This is a book that I know and thought was very good. Various national and regional human development reports commissioned by UNDP or done independently have used a human security framework, and some of them are within the boxes of citizen security, so crime and violence, or within the box of armed conflict, and then often on with a focus on state building within such contexts. But others are more so, they pick up what they think are priority security challenges in the time and place concerned. So that's the last column here. And some are trying to compare, review all major threats, and then look at linkages, look at priorities, and then maybe be a prelude to a follow-up focused study. So the Arab countries 2009 report was a comprehensive report. And with Oscar Gomez and other colleagues, we have surveyed this work, and there are 2 or 3 papers available, because this region-specific or nationally specific human security investigation can be very interesting. Lastly, then reviewing roles. I said it's a sort of, I see it as a policy philosophy, so it's not a tight package of evolved tools. There are some tools, and you can connect to many sorts of tools, but it's centrally a policy perspective, and it allows flexible exploration of experiences of insecurity. And what has emerged in these sorts of studies is recognition of how insecurity, as experienced, depends on the intersection of many factors. As a result of that, it's often surprising what actually are the insecurities and or what are perceived as the insecurities, and it needs case-specific investigation. And the experience of insecurity is subjective to significant extent. So we have to study experienced insecurity in a flexible way. Quite a lot of the national and regional human development reports and other work on human security began to combine both objective and subjective measures and reports. And you find a bit of that also in the Arab States study of 2009. So the reference to the subjective measures or the self-specified measures of security and insecurity are helpful for understanding and also for identifying values that may be felt and overlooked. And this comparison between the objective measures and the quote subjective measures, as I mentioned, often indicates interesting disparities. And so the Benin study here noticed big differences between the districts of the country from its Human Development Index and the Human Security Index. Human Security Index was based on subjective specification of insecurity. And so we have a research agenda here in which you can compare, this is from our UNDP guidance note, you can compare how experts perceive issues and how public or particular publics perceive issues. And sometimes they are consistent, but not necessarily right. And sometimes they are very interestingly inconsistent. Lastly, and connected to this, here's a recent paper by Larson and colleagues about how they are found the concept of human security relevant for looking at risk modeling. The second of their comments is the obvious one, that human security is a broad concept. It makes them look broadly, so it encompasses a range of threats. So it helps them to design their study of risk in an open way. But then further, the human security concept allows us to focus on individuals and local communities' perceptions and allows integration of local cultural dimensions and risk perception and social construction. I could go on, but I must stop. So back to you, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Des. May I invite Dr. Mahmoud Messkoub to continue and further discuss this concept within the context of the MENA region.
Thank you very much, Noor. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and thank Tamara, Noor, and Rana, all of them, for organizing this, which is very helpful for me and also very helpful intellectually for development of social policy in the MENA. And thanks to Des for setting up the meeting with the discussion of human security. My work on social policy has always had a human security approach implicit in it, not explicitly, because I have always been working with the social policy through focusing on needs, having a right-based approach, focusing on universal social provisioning, enhancing capabilities. All of them are subsumed under this human security approach that Des has discussed already. The other point I want to make is that at the beginning, my approach to social policy is very broad, and I only touch on the risk-based approach as part of the social protection. So I don't consider social policy in the narrow focus of social protection, which is very common these days. To begin with, we have to move from social welfare, which is a mutual support and mutual aid, faith-based, charity, etc., to a state-led social policy, which is connected to the emergence of nation state. So social welfare goes beyond the social policy and does involve the state, but social policy is a matter for the state. A state organized support to individuals and households and that forms part of the broad economic development agenda of diversification of the economy that requires a healthy and educated labor force and stable social environment. So social policy through the state contributes to development and at the end, a stable social environment, which was part of the discussion that just Des brought on the agenda. Now, it is a social contract between labor and capital, if you want to see it in that way, or citizen and state. So social policy with some human security objective, and the importance of this human security objective is its variability across countries. So when we discuss human security, it is not the same across the world. And that is an important part of the social policy discussion. Next slide, please. Now, we have rights, social welfare, and social policy. Social policy is societal, and individuals and communities organize activities to achieve certain objectives. Whereas social policy is about improving human welfare and meeting human needs, as well as being concerned with distribution of resources and assets. And this is important because this takes us away from social protection, which has a very, very narrow objective. And it's about developing capabilities of individuals and contributing to economic and social life of a country. So social policy not only covers the provision of health and education, which are about promotion of human capability, but also laws, rules, regulations that protect human capability. So we are dealing with both developing human capabilities and also protecting. So social policy is more than social protection. If I move to the next slide, I prefer to go a bit faster because I will discuss some of these issues there. Now, if you come to social policy in the MENA region, the nation state and social policy was part of the nation building project. So we had the constitutional, we moved from constitutional and political declaration to social policies. And these are, I'm giving an example, Algeria, Iran, Egypt, and Tunisia. So wherever we had social movements, social upheavals, some kind of a revolution, these ideas of the social movement, social revolution, work themselves into the constitution and political declarations. And they become part of the building, consolidating power base of ruling elite in military, civil service, etc. So this second part of it is just some kind of a patronage, which is part of the social policy in the region. But seeing social policy in the region just as patronage in my view is not correct, because we have constitutions, we have political declarations, all of which are coming from the street, if you like. However, social policy in the region is top-down. It's financed by all revenues, foreign aid by the oil-rich countries to the oil-poor countries in the region and from outside the region. Social policy is based on remittances, etc. But oil revenue have been very important in all oil exporting countries and some of the countries which have not been oil exporters. Now, human development improvements in the region, there has been decline in maternal mortality, infant mortality, child mortality. There has been increase in life expectancy, improved educational outcomes like literacy, school attendance, gender parity, etc. Now, we have human insecurity despite all this. First of all, we have the problem of economic cycle. Oil boom and bust, that has contributed to, that will contribute to insecurity. And social policies that combine promotive and protective functions. Promotive health and education during the boom time, protection in the bust. Now, in the region, we have had promotion in terms of health and education, but in terms of protection, we have had problems because there has been a lack of shortage of protection in the bust time. Social protection is variable across countries. For example, of social protection, we have got protection for security in old age, disability, sickness, maternity, injury at work, unemployment, family allowance, etc., etc. We have a range of social protection in the region, but they are very variable across the region. We also have got problems with regard to entitlement and coverage of social protection. We have, for most countries, in fact, perhaps for all of them, formal labor contracts are important for entitlement to unemployment benefit, for entitlement to injury, etc. at work. Perhaps family allowance is not linked to a formal contract in some countries, but even then that's very limited. We also have got issues to do with the migrants, displaced people in different countries who are not covered by any kind of the social protection, especially if they are illegal immigrants. If I consider the insecurity in terms of health, which is a central concern of human need theory and also important part of the human security, we have got here a percentage of GDP which is low in the region and focuses on curative health. We have high spending on expensive diagnostic curative healthcare, general neglect of primary and preventive healthcare, basic health services in the mid-income MENA covers between 75 to 90% of the population, so coverage is not full. But remember that when we talk about population in the region, we talk about citizens. In some Arab Gulf, Persian Gulf countries, only 10% of the total population is citizen. The rest of them are immigrants. And if you are a poor immigrant, you are not covered by proper health coverage, whereas the rich expatriates have got high coverage. We also have got out-of-pocket expenses, which are quite high in mid-income. The out-of-pocket expenses, which could be quite high, up to 80% in Yemen and 6% in Qatar, which is a small gas-rich country. And in the middle, you have got about 40 to 60% of health expenditures out of pocket in a lot of mid-income countries like Algeria, Iran, Morocco, Egypt. There is also, go back please, you jumped too fast, that's okay. You also have got rural-urban divide in the region and the concentration of health services in urban areas. You have got neglect of low-income, low-status migrants, displaced people, refugees, ethnic minorities. And also you have got fragmentation of health insurance service provision. You have got a lot of private interest in both in the insurance and also in the provision of health services. So you can see that human security in the region is quite high. And just again, one example of health. If you could go on next one. There is an aspect to human security in the social policy literature, and that's human security over time with regard to education, with regard to old age, and things that over time people needs change, and also need to have to take note of this change over time with regard to skill development and capabilities. Education is one example of it, that would enhance capabilities, reduce poverty if you get a job after your education, because most educated people would have better potential of being out of poverty. That is the evidence across the board. You will have entitlement to social protection through your employment, etc., etc. Now, percentage of GDP on education in the region is the same as similar countries with the same GDP per capita, but the result in the region do not match the result in other countries of similar GDP per capita. Years of education attainment is low, school dropout rate is high, and scores on international tests are low, lower than compared with the comparators. We have higher unemployment of educated youth, which is a major problem in the region. And you have a low integrability, that is a mismatch of educated and poor in sectors where the jobs are. So jobs are created, but poor people and educated people cannot take advantage of them. And that's another major problem in the region. When we come to welfare in old age, which is part of this human security over time, you have formal sector employment being an important part of qualifying for pension in old age. The other issue, which is not a problem for those people who get a pension, is high replacement rate. Pension over salary, which is the replacement rate, in most MENA countries is quite high, 80%. Whereas on average, OECD countries is 57%, or middle income Latin American 50, 60, 70%. And that creates a problem in part because of budgetary problem for the state, and also for, which is the main provider of pension, and cutting the pensions to the rest of the population and reducing the space to develop and enlarge the pension scheme to others. And the final issue on the welfare in old age is this, that the region is aging very fast. The percentage of 65% plus in population doubles in Iran in 17 years' time. That is less than 20 years' time, population of the 65 plus will double. This took France 100 years. Whereas France started with a higher base of economic and social and legal regulations to manage the financial system, the banking system, the pension system of the state, etc. Iran has to develop all these things in a matter of one generation, maybe 30 years. And other countries are not behind. So this is a very important thing in terms of security, human security over time and old age. The other major human security issue in the region is the reform of the subsidy structure from indirect subsidies on goods, etc., to direct cash transfer subsidies. Now, this will create, this is needed, by the way, in the region, because the indirect subsidies give more to the people who use the services, like, for example, to use goods and services which are used by the richer people, like, for example, indirect subsidy to gasoline. So there is a need for it, but it creates new insecurities due to inflation, commitment to the cash transfer, and lack of support services. For example, you need to develop the health service to cover more people at a lower out-of-pocket cost in order to replace indirect subsidies, say, to drugs, to cash transfer. So this is something which we have to bear in mind, that cash transfer, in absence of broader social policy agenda, is going to create more insecurity. Next one, please. Now, another long-term security issue is human security and sustainability. Environmental sustainability and social policy are very much linked. And I worked on a paper recently discussing the economic policy and sustainability of social policy. And two important issues came up in my work is that, first of all, GDP as a measure of development cannot be used in terms of long-term sustainability. On the other hand, we need growth, both for employment, no, go back please, growth for both employment, infrastructure, taxes, social policy. So if you talk about the GDP growth, which is needed for a lot of things that we need for human security, we need to discuss this growth. What this growth is going to be. On the other hand, sustainability has put on the agenda the idea that we cannot continue with this growth. We have to have some idea of degrowth, a low growth strategy in order to be able to guarantee, or at least to protect, the future of humanity, and also the future of the current generation who are young. So we need to discuss degrowth and low growth strategy in the context of what, for whom, how, and when we are going to produce things. What are we going to produce? For whom are we going to produce? How is going to be done and when? And here we need to bring in the theories of human needs and human security to discuss and negotiate and organize production and distributional choices. So human need and human security comes right into the center of sustainability of human social policy. Having discussed human security, we have to talk about female insecurity in the MENA region. We cannot do it without discussing female insecurity. Let us note that the social policy that we have discussed so far have been focused on basic need aspect of human security, with limited social dialogue, with limited popular participation and democratic accountability. It has been a patronage and clientelist model, coverage based towards bias towards military, civil service, and formal sector. This patriarchal model has been based on male breadwinner, and that by its very nature has created female insecurity. Social welfare through male household head. The influence of Sharia law, which impinges on dress code, inheritance rights, divorce laws, child custody, etc. And if there are no laws in terms of specifically against the women, if you don't have a universal registration identity card system, as in Egypt, women access to social services and subsidized goods has to go through spouse and male kins. So this patriarchal model, which is partly cultural, partly religious, partly social, partly institutionalized, will discriminate against women. Another issue here, female employment concentrated in the informal sector, but as we noted, formal sector employment is required for a lot of the social access to social protection and social policy measures. We also have got general low female labor force participation and its concentration in informal sector and rural areas. We also have, on top of all these things, we have an informal security regime where people can't have the support in the formal sector. They retreat into the family. If you don't have a health service cover, who will look after you? Non-state sector, families, charities, etc., and social, and they provide some kind of social provisioning, but women as being the main home carer and caring the society base in general will bear the burden. And not the final issue on this subject is female-headed households are overrepresented among the poor household. Now, I think the final slide. So we need to work towards human security. And historical experience shows that universal provision of health and education, public services of water, electricity, etc., have made the biggest impact on achieving human development goals. So universal provision must be on the agenda. But poor and inadequate public services and lack of proper accountability by the politicians, civil servant has undermined universalist social policies. Basically, social provisioning has been undermined, both in terms of availability and also the lack of accountability. So it has weakened or removed completely social contract between the state and citizens, further undermining legitimacy of a state-led social policy. Social protection and targeting the poor strategy has come on board now. So the state cannot provide it, so let's target the limited budget we have and cut the total budget because the poor are not getting enough of it. So this will fail to achieve the universal objective of promotion and protection of human capability, which is linked to a developmental strategy. Simply because the targeting strategy has limited objectives. So we need to go back to the universalist social policy ideals of a development state, but within a democratic political environment that promotes genuine popular engagement and participation, as well as transparency and accountability, in order to arrive at an inclusive and new social contract. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve human security, especially in the middle of a pandemic and wars and upheaval that is engulfing the region. Thank you very much. Sorry to go over time.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk and for further situating it within the MENA context. May I invite Dr. Wali Aslam to further discuss this issue?
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you everybody for joining. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am based at the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath. And we are partners with Dr. Rana Jawad, who is based in social policy. So she is our principal investigator, and I'm one of the co-investigators on the MENA social protection project, that GCRF project that Rana talked about earlier. So the role that we are playing in our politics and IR department on this project is bringing the international perspective and the perspective of global conflicts and global security angle to the issues of social protection and of course human security. And that is what I'll be doing in this brief talk as well, in which bring that international political angle on the issues of social policy and human security in the MENA region. So when we talk about social policy and human security, shall we say, the elephant in the room, or probably one of the biggest issues to discuss, is the idea of state capacities. And state capacities, of course, remain one of the key determinants of how the policies will deliver. And first of all, they'll be created and built, and how they will be delivered. So when to bring the international perspective on state capacities, what we need to do is we need to look at the contemporary international political scenario and look at broader threats to state capacities that we are facing going forward, basically looking at the last couple of decades and going forward. And then what are the opportunities that we see in the international political realm or the international political world to enhance or strengthen those state capacities. So in the next few minutes, I will just talk about those 2 points separately. So first looking at the threats to state capacities, and then looking at the opportunities that we have. One of the biggest issues, or shall we say the threats to state capacities in the MENA region, is this huge geopolitical shift that we are witnessing, we are experiencing in global politics currently as we speak. So the last 2 decades were all about terrorism and counterterrorism. Those of us who were studying international relations, we were bombarded from every side about security and terrorism, and very much state-centered idea of and very much traditional idea of how to ensure security. So that, of course, has its roots in the 9/11 attacks, but the process, of course, you can take it back, as far back as the Second World War onward. And again, I don't want to discuss the historical perspective at this stage. But what we are seeing with the arrival of the new administration in the White House, and that started with Trump, but it's been escalated, is this huge shift towards the angle of great power politics. So the idea of global war on terrorism is going down in significance, and it is giving space to this huge new emerging phenomena of great power politics and the emergence of these camps. One is the China/Asian, Southeast Asian camp, and then you have the Western camp. And of course, Russia is somewhere, on the Chinese side as well. Now, how is that relevant to what we are discussing here? It is relevant to what we are discussing here because for good or for bad reasons, a focus on the global war on terrorism did keep a focus on the issue of state capacities in the MENA region for the last 20 years. Because this very critical idea that we link back to the Bush Doctrine is that if you have weak states or fragile states or states with weaker capacities, they are potentially a threat to not only their own populations, but also to the Western security. And of course, that at least put attention on the issue of state capacities. Of course, I'm not saying that that actually helped in building state capacities, but at least that attention was there in the focus. And as a result of that, we saw a massive effort being put into building state institutions. And of course, as disastrous as it was, the Iraq War, but we also saw concurrent funding going into multiple and basically opening up these states like Afghanistan and to some extent other countries as well, opening up to modernization or bringing some kind of modernity to the institutions of state capacities. And this whole phenomena is of course under threat now because now the focus is shifting away. Western military establishments and security establishments are almost bored of terrorism and counterterrorism, and they want to play bigger games, quote unquote. So that is one of the big issues, one of the big threats to state capacities, which we fear that the focus will shift away. The second big threat that I see going forward, and that again has happened in the last 8 to 10 years, is the rise of popular nationalist governments. And again, they are happening. That is not only happening in Europe and North America, but also in multiple parts of Latin America and Asia as well. But a significant side effect of that development taking place in the West is the huge hit that we are seeing as we speak to overseas assistance funding. And that, of course, is critical to building state capacities in the MENA region. And that is, this rise of popular nationalism or populist governments at home, and the idea that there is a need to put your country first, and the far off distant places don't you can't just pay attention to them and forget your own responsibility. So that is again a second big threat that I will say that we have going forward. And of course, the third obvious big threat is the global economic slowdown. And what happens with as a result of the slowdown is the local governments at the national level in MENA, at the regional level, and of course at the Western level. And there is far less money to spend on the development side or on the human security side when you are coping with bare minimum, like we say with the case of Lebanon, when you're coping with bare minimum to run the basic affairs of a state, like keeping the streets clean or keeping the basic services going. So it looks like some of the lofty goals or some of the more important goals look like too hard to pay attention to, or too ambitious for the time being. So these are some of the international, if you look from the international political angle, these are some of the threats that we have. But having said that, we also have a number of emerging opportunities coming that we have seen in the last few years, and of course they will take more of a center stage. One of those opportunities of collective action and building state capacities is of course related to climate change. And nobody can deny the awareness that the issue of climate change brings and the activism that comes with it. What we also need to remember is the byproduct or the side effect or an added advantage of this discussion over climate change, that what it does is it builds an international consensus on the need for a collective change, the need for communication, the need for coming together, and the need for doing something together collectively. And that is a byproduct of the awareness over climate change. So when you bring people together or when people come together, they don't only discuss just one narrow aspect of global warming, or people becoming homeless because of floods and so on. There is a broader global dialogue and global discussion happening or taking place on the street as well as online. And I think there is a huge potential to build on that collective effort. Okay, I think we really need to look at the broader picture and not just focus on the narrow aspect of the climate change or the politics of environment, but look at the opportunities that bringing together of people gives us for that broader dialogue. So this dialogue is essential. Secondly, another opportunity, of course, is given by the current pandemic, which has really shown us that human beings are essentially links in a chain. And if one link is weak in one part of the world, then it has an effect overall. But again, one byproduct of this pandemic has been that it has exposed deeper weaknesses that have remained unaddressed for a long time, but they need to be addressed in order to have sustainable and resilient societies that are, of course, inherently peaceful in the longer term, because we also know that these issues have direct linkages with conflict. Of course, inequalities and inequities have direct linkages with conflict as well. And again, that side effect of the pandemic and efforts to curb that pandemic, I think we should also value that and the importance that we can place to the deeper weaknesses. I think that again is a key element that we need to look at. So those deeper weaknesses can be, of course, poverty related and lack of opportunity related. So again, this opportunity can be grasped if there is a will. So looking at deeper weaknesses and working collectively, as I said, with regard to climate action. So just to coming to words, I'm just at my 10-minute spot. Just to conclude my key point, I think there is this slightly worrying awareness, shall we say, or worrying feeling that we can say is developing, that, or can we say an illusion is developing, that with this huge new challenges that I talked about emerging, MENA is no longer as significant or as relevant, be it issues of terrorism or global terrorism, or be it the issues of great power politics and so on. And of course, that is basically an illusion. And we know that the focus has to remain on MENA, and the recent conflict in Gaza is just one small example that the importance of MENA cannot go down in significance, and it has to stay on. And we should also be wary that when we take our focus away and we look the other way, that opens risks for abuse by local actors and by regional actors or by international actors who set to benefit if people are not looking, basically, who set to, of course, we don't need to talk about the whole issues of, state level corruption, mafias, and all sorts of complications. So I think we will be facing a big loss, or there is a fear that if we take the focus away from MENA going forward, tackling all these other developments that I talked about, I think in the longer term that will be far more counterproductive, and we will come back to where we started. So these are some of my comments. Thank you. Very happy to hear any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Wali. This is very insightful, and I think it's also good to place it in the context of the international relations perspective. And indeed, let's hope that despite it being an epidemic, this at least places some focus and offers a window of opportunity for addressing some of these deeper issues. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Natalie Boucher to present her work and her perspective within the capacity of the UNDP. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity, Rana, colleagues from the HDCA. This was very, very refreshing. And actually, when I was requested to intervene in this particular webinar, I didn't know where to start from. As UNDP, of course, we are investing in research, in analysis, and of course, the series of human development reports are part of this work stream, but we are also basically mandated to support countries in advancing the Sustainable Development Agenda. So I'm going to go over this presentation. I'm going to try to be brief, but I do believe that some of the points that I will be making will be speaking and resonating very much with some of the points and even questions that were raised earlier by Dr. Gasper, by Dr. Mahmoud and Walid. So let me start from the concept, and that's where Dr. Gasper started with. Before coming to and joining this webinar, I said, well, okay, where do we stand? Because one point I would like to make is that actually in our daily work as UNEP, we are not necessarily using the human security concepts, you know, as a programmatic or as a policy concept. We have moved actually towards other frameworks that I will be introducing to you. But I was just thinking it was good to try to have a human security reading of some of the global human development reports that were produced by UNDP. And actually there is a storyline around human security. And over the years, I would say, even if the concept itself is not used necessarily systematically, there's been a storyline and a real effort to get deeper and to probe deeper in human security, but particularly also in its implication for policy making, for solutions making. So it's true that when we start with the Human Development Report 1994, then the concept was nascent, and it really created and generated a shift from the state security to people security and community security. So it was really, I would say, a paradigm shift in terms of approaching human security. 10 years later, actually, another Human Development Report was produced that really, in fact, dig deeper in this notion, but moving to the notion of vulnerability. And I think Dr. Gasper mentioned about the nexus between human security and vulnerability. But why this move? Perhaps because the concept of vulnerability, which obviously is critical today, was providing also lending itself for policy actions in a way that could sustain human progress in a kind of positive way. So moving to 2019, I was reading again the Global Human Development Report 2019, and this report brought at the forefront of the discussion this issue of inequalities in capacities, entrenched and structural inequalities, also mentioning and stressing that inequalities are a key obstacle to enhancing human security and beyond that, human resilience and development. And the last report, and of course, as UNDP, I cannot overlook the last report, and I think the latest interventions were very much connecting the dots, is saying one thing, from my own reading, is saying one thing, is that human security and planet security cannot be disconnected. Basically, now the deal and the biggest challenge for researchers, but also for policymakers, is to find a kind of a smart balance and integration as well between, I would say, social welfare and ecological welfare. So I think this is something that needs to be taken into account increasingly, possibly even within the field of social policy making. So I was just saying that as such, the human security concept globally was not necessarily used as a guiding programmatic type of concept or framework, actually, but very much in line with the notion of human security and the underpinning vulnerability, threats, risk dimension surrounding it. What the UN and UNDP has been an important contributor has really started to work on three interconnected framework. A first framework is what we call leaving no one behind. And this framework is really speaking to the need to look at the way people are deprived, excluded, so to speak, in various areas, and how these various areas of exclusions are actually intersecting with each other. I will get back to this, but basically this leaving no one behind framework is focused essentially on 5 exclusion drivers that, of course, are critical from a human security lens. One is on discrimination-based factors based on status, identity, and so forth, geography, but also governance, the socioeconomic status of people, of course, but also the exposure of people to shocks and fragility. So it's a very comprehensive framework that can help in an integrated manner to identify the main drivers of exclusion of some people. The other big framework which has emerged in a context where basically uncertainty, shocks, threats are becoming so-called the new normal is a resilience building framework. And here I will not get into the conceptual issues too much, but basically what this framework is emphasizing is the need to look at risk and threats from a multidimensional perspective and not in a siloed way where risks are considered individually, but it's really to look at risk from a systemic perspective, acknowledging that the threats, the risks that people are facing and communities are facing are interconnected. And I do think that COVID-19 has really exposed this interconnectedness between risk. Another key dimension is the need to think about building resilience is not the business of government. It's a whole of society approach, and what this framework is pushing for is a really multi-stakeholder approach, but actually a strong emphasis on local level, on community engagement, the development also of dialogue mechanisms for prevention. And then another pillar is, of course, the pillar of like building resilience people, but also communities and systems resilience capacities to various kind of shocks and threats. So basically resilience, risk-informed development and leaving no one behind, I would say, if I have to summarize, is the kind of building blocks to look at sustainable development from a human security, human resilience, and I would simply say from a resilience building perspective. And actually, I work very much on resilience issues and the SDGs, as Tamara was saying. And in 2019, I actually wrote a paper to see to which extent the SDGs, everybody knows about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and their 169 targets were speaking to resilience building imperatives for sustainable development. And I was just going through the various targets. There are 169 targets that are actually calling for policy action on various fronts. And many of these targets are really speaking to the development of individual, community, and government and systemic resilience capacities. So it's just a way of thinking, of saying that when we are talking about human security, and I think this is a key message from the UN and UNDP in particular, is that we should not forget that there is right now an agenda, which is called the 2030 agenda and the SDGs that can provide an operational framework for addressing human security and human resilience issues in a very integrated manner, once again, because as just mentioned, we cannot think about human security, even in 1994, was defined across 7 areas, right? We could add more. What perhaps at this time was not seen as critical is the way all these areas of threats are intersecting and interconnected. So I think that what the the 2030 agenda is bringing is really a push for integrated approach, where basically human security is not only about basic needs, food, and so, no, it's food security threats are interconnected with climate threats and so forth and so forth. So we need integrated approaches. And COVID-19 has really exposed the need for these integrated approaches to resilience and human security building. I will not get into the details or the results of more than 140 socioeconomic impact assessments conducted by UNDP and those across the globe, which is really showing that COVID-19 has challenged human security in all its dimensions. But not only this, that the first round of impacts of COVID beyond health impacts can also generate new risk. We are talking now about looming debt crisis, more social protests, possibly, and so forth. So just to say that even the apprehension of threats and risks needs to be seen from a dynamic perspective. So this is really something I wanted to share there, which is actually echoing some of the points that were made earlier. So just to go back, and it's interesting that Dr. Gasper started with, of course, the Arab Human Development Report, because the question was, what is the traction of this concept in the region? If there is one region where the concept of human security got some traction, is certainly the MENA region, the Arab region. And it's interesting to see that indeed the report was embracing the 7 dimensions of threats, including occupation, worth pointing it. Interesting to see also in the way, there was no specific ranking, if I do remember, but interesting to see also that in 2009, the environment was placed as first in the list of threats. I mean, the environment, I mean, the ecological threats was coming first before the state, before growth, before health, and so forth. So it's quite interesting. And of course, we can say, well, this is certainly, this should be read again with a fresh look, and perhaps with a more integrated perspective. And this is perhaps where UNDP is looking, what UNDP is looking at now, the intersect between these different threats, with this notion that social policies alone, climate policies, economic policies, will not be able to tackle human security if they are not speaking to each other in a consistent manner. To answer Dr. Gasper's question about what is, has this report inspired more thinking, more research in the MENA region? Actually, UNDP was just before COVID on the verge of producing a new Arab Human Development Report, and in preparing for such a report, some papers have been produced that, from my perspective at least, are really speaking, or are really a natural follow-up to this human security report of 2009. So there is actually a research paper which is looking at leaving no one behind towards inclusive citizenship in Arab countries. And actually the notion of citizenship as well could be particularly relevant for a human security research agenda. I was mentioning about the leaving no one behind framework, and this slide is providing is highlighting how we are approaching this 5-factor framework in the MENA region, and how we are analyzing key factors of exclusion, with, of course, these key factors interacting strongly in the most fragile, including conflict-affected countries in the region. Again, another follow-up to this is that, and I think it was mentioned by Dr. Gasper as well, is that when we are approaching human security, and because there is a strong element of subjectivity in human security, it's extremely important in this, when we want to shape programming, when we want to shape policy advice, it's very important to listen to people. And that's something where that UNDP has been very much investing in recently, and actually as a background to this research paper I was mentioning before, UNDP interviewed about 6,000 Arab citizens across various countries to get the perspectives on these various exclusion drivers I was mentioning before. And it's very interesting to see, and it would be good actually to compare this, as Dr. Gasper was saying, with the actual data, but very interesting to see how the various dimensions of human security were felt as significant gaps in the region still now, and this was before COVID. So I would assume that the data, those perception surveys findings would have even shifted elsewhere after COVID. Again, another point, I think it was mentioned by Dr. Wali, that for UNDP, clearly human security cannot be disconnected from the tremendous threats coming from the climate challenge in the Arab region. And actually we have recently established a fully fledged SDG climate facility, which is really trying to promote climate-friendly solutions that can also deliver on other dimensions of human insecurity, be it in the areas of livelihoods and so forth. So the idea is really important, even when we think about social policies, to think about the risk and the specific vulnerabilities that people are facing in the context of climate change in the region and its implication on water scarcity and all the things, all the threats we are very well aware of. So this is something I wanted to share, at least when it comes to the conceptual thinking and the policy thinking. Another dimension, and I think I've been very much exposed to this, as mentioned by Tamara, I was heading the sub-regional facility for the Syria crisis. And in the context of this huge, protracted displacement and humanitarian crisis, UNDP has spearheaded a resilience-based approach, which is looking, of course, at the vulnerabilities that not only people, but communities and systems in countries hosting refugees are facing. So it's a very comprehensive approach with this notion that ultimately the resilience of people or security of host communities and refugees depends on needs to be approached from with a very comprehensively. So we are looking at both individual, community, and systemic capacities, and all the partners responding to this crisis are working at the individual level on education, psychological support. There is a strong focus, and I think that's critical from a human security perspective, on social cohesion, building social cohesion at the levels of communities, but also strengthening the capacities of ministries, of municipalities to manage the various impacts of the refugee crisis for the benefits of all. Just to say that again, an important shift is that in the way we are approaching sustainable development is through developing databases on what we call crisis risk dashboards, where we are looking at a constellation of indicators of conflicts, but also drivers. And you can see from the screen, we are looking at the rule of law, we are looking at marginalization, we are looking at inequality, violent extremism, but also the environment. So just to say that we are approaching this from a very comprehensive perspective. Let me just finish by a few considerations, if you allow me, because I think this was the main topic of this seminar, a few considerations regarding, well, the nexus between social protection and human security. I would say that the two notions are speaking to each other conceptually, because first is that we need a kind of multidimensional risk approach to social policy making and social protection policy making in particular, which means that social protection programs, for whatever they are, needs to be designed in light of the multiple but also overlapping risks, threats and vulnerabilities that people are currently facing. So this paves the way for creating new indexes, composite indexes, overlying multi-dimensional vulnerability indexes with the mapping of, geographical mappings of climate risk or environmental fragility, for instance, where we want to provide social protection support. Social protection policies and programs needs to be context and conflict sensitive, because we hear that social protection and policies can do a lot for reducing inequalities and by this way to prevent conflict. But what we see on the ground, and especially in the context of crisis, is that we have to be extremely careful. And that conflict sensitivity is very, very important. In Lebanon, for instance, where social protection system is weak, a lot is going in the country through humanitarian social assistance, so to speak. And the way host communities and refugee communities are benefiting from this support has a lot of implications in terms of social cohesion and in terms of potential risk of conflicts. And that's the reason why we actually developed a tension monitoring system in Lebanon to be able to grasp this risk. Inclusiveness, and I think that's a point that was raised by, if I'm not mistaken, by Dr. Mahmoud. I think indeed we are talking about inclusiveness now because we see that in the MENA region, the social protection system are excluding a lot of people, right? Including, as you said, people on the move, migrants, refugees, and so forth, and informal workers, as we know. But inclusiveness should be seen not only from the viewpoint of coverage, so to speak, also this is important, but also to go along with legal and policy reforms that tackle the root cause of social exclusion, policy changes, legal changes. Another dimension, and I think it was also mentioned, is the need to reconsider in the region this transition from universal, but as we say, inefficient, regressive subsidy schemes to narrowly poverty-targeted safety nets. I think we need to rethink that from a conflict prevention perspective, for sure, from a cost-effectiveness perspective. And clearly there is a need also to rethink what would it mean in the Arab region to set up those social protection floors that the UN and others have been talking about. So this is definitely an area for further research. Inclusiveness, but also gender responsiveness, And recently, UNDP and women joined forces to develop a global gender response tracker to see whether the social protection response at large, the policy response to COVID-19 in the region were gender responsive or not, especially in the area of protection, economic security of women, social protection, that's measures are they taking care of unpaid care, the unpaid care burden, for instance, violence against women. And the result, the findings were quite striking. We're out of 225 measures, there were but only 53 measures that were gender sensitive along these different lines. Governance, I think that's another area where the UN system and UNDP is likely to invest, is the governance of social protection systems. The responsiveness of systems to people's demands and needs, including shock responsiveness, if we consider that people are vulnerable to shocks. Accountability and transparency, including strong participatory monitoring and evaluation systems, but in a cross-cutting manner. What I think is really important, and we see it every day because the situation is so fluid. We need for a continuous investment in data and evidence building on social protection needs, of course, but also, and I want to stress the point, in the analysis of the impact of social protection policies, the socioeconomic impact, but also maybe the environmental impact, the impacts on social cohesion, the impacts on conflicts, but also the impact of other policies on social protection needs. And that's, again, a point I want to stress. We cannot claim or even make the working assumption that social protection policies are going to work to reduce inequality and prevent conflict if other policies are running against the tide. So I think this integrated approach is very important. Of course, what we saw in the recent periods, that there are a lot of opportunities to be tapped from the digital area, so to speak, and the use of digital systems and technology to improve the governance of social policies and social protection policies. That's something that needs to be looked at as well. And again, multi-stakeholder approach are clearly needed for all the reasons mentioned. Last but not least, in the context of displacement, and I think it was mentioned by Mahmoud, obviously there is a need to strengthen what we call the humanitarian development nexus in the area of social protection, where basically, even from a conflict prevention perspective in some countries, it's very critical for humanitarian partners to also use their comparative advantages, their capacities to strengthen national systems and to make sure that ultimately the social protection systems in the countries, in the host countries, are contributing to build resilience of all people. And as mentioned, again, integrated approach, and this is an area for further research and programmatic work, actually. How can we better link social protection programs to other key services, to economic inclusion and empowerment, and also, and that's an area where UNDP is investing also, to disaster risk management and the management, sustainable management of natural resources and the environment. I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. I had to rush a bit, but I hope some of the points were interesting to share or resonating with the work that colleagues are doing.
Okay, dear Natalie, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation and bringing in also the UNDP element in it. And I think you, in a way, it is a nice roundup of all the different presentations, providing connections to all the points that were mentioned and providing us with food for thoughts on how to move this forward. I would like to thank you as the panelists, but also the audience members for staying with us. And I hope the audience members found it as interesting as we did. And if it is okay with the panelists, I would like to ask them firstly if it's okay for me to share your slides with the audience members at a later stage, but also if it's okay to stay just a little bit longer. I know we're over time already, but just to ask a few questions that were raised, and then any others we can also always come back and write this in as a separate message to the attendees. So for the attendees, please don't hesitate to mail us your questions as well at any time. Is that okay with you? Yeah, okay. So I would like to ask two questions. One, building on a question that was asked by Ada, which was talking about universal social policy. But I wanted to ask, okay, what could be seen as successful policy interventions within the MENA that can also inform and address these human securities over the past years? And secondly, I would like to raise a point that was given by Michael Drinkwater, who stated it's easy to be pessimistic now about the potential for social policy to address human security in the MENA, especially given the effects of the pandemic, conflict, and political failures. I've worked a lot in Lebanon recently, and social policy has gone backwards and human vulnerability is vastly increased. Is there any potential to use the human capability approach to restore some idea of potential opportunities, for instance, in terms of tapping into people and community ingenuity? I hope I pronounced that correctly. It seems states without social activism cannot be relied upon to address current human security issues. May I ask if each of you perhaps can take 2 minutes at most to just share your thoughts on these two questions raised? Thank you. And perhaps we can go by order of the speakers. So I start with Des, if that is okay.
Tamara, I'm not a MENA specialist, so I more or less pass. I was impressed and interested by the report by Nathalie on the work they are doing, and I look forward to exploring some of that. And I think you and I should also send Nathalie our paper on the SDGs and human security. So I leave the time for others.
Okay, thank you so much. May I invite Dr. Mahmoud Messkoub?
Thank you very much to all the speakers who came after me, Vasil and Nathalie. I really enjoyed the discussion and the contribution they made to our social policy debate. I want to answer specifically the question about what happened since last year about the pandemic and social role of social policy, to make 2 points. One is that if you look at the history of the pandemic management since last year, well, it's a history anyway, 12 months history, very intensive history. Countries which have had a well-established health system and health service have done better than others in terms of managing the pandemic. Although, for example, I look at both China and South Korea and Japan, Germany, Britain, and France, etc., compared with the US. At the beginning, some of these countries made a lot of mistakes. I don't want to deny their mistakes or whitewash their mistakes. But once they acknowledged the problem, they moved very fast. I mean, Britain made a lot of mistakes at the first 6 months, but once they moved on to the vaccination and promotion of vaccines, etc., they have brought down the death rate massively, very quickly. But their mistakes are there, rather, the number of deaths they have had. But the lesson I want to learn about this for the MENA region is rebuilding the health system, not in terms of just pandemic management, but general health system. I mean, if you look at Cuba, at a very, very low the level of per capita income, has been able to achieve this similar per capita death rate as the Scandinavian country of Norway and Denmark. I think I'm correct in saying that. So I think it's important to rebuild the health system to be able to cope with pandemic. This doesn't mean that you just build up the vaccination side of the health system. No, in general, to have a health system which is based on a linkage of health services for the basic health delivery, basic preventive monitoring, etc., will give us the platform to manage the future pandemic. I'll close on that one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud. May I invite Dr. Wali Aslam?
Well, thank you. Absolutely. For me, the idea of human security goes hand in hand with the idea of human agency. And if anything that we have learned in the last 12 months is that the communities who are at the receiving end of the global developmental flows and are at the receiving end of the conflict as well, unfortunately, they really need to take agency and they need to take matters into their own hands, because if they don't look after themselves, nobody else will. So I think empowering the agency and ensuring that the communities make space for their own voice and take control of their affairs, I think that is something we have learned recently, and I hope that long it continues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And may I invite Dr. Natalie Boucher?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting comment. I mean, say, well, it's true that in Lebanon right now, or at least from the UN side, there is a real appetite to really help in a way or another to strengthen the social protection system in Lebanon. But the reality on the ground is that indeed much of the social protection, so to speak, is provided outside the government by communities themselves, the civil societies, and so forth. So I think there is a real agenda for research in this area when we are looking at formal social protection systems and so forth, and what is the nexus between those formal systems and more informal community-based social protection schemes, and how can they sort of cross-fertilize in a way in a context where we know there is no one-fits-all approach, so to speak. And again, I think it was the last point of my presentation when we think even about reshaping formal social protection system or rethinking in the Arab region and strengthening and so forth. We need to invest to engage people. Definitely, we need to engage people. Where the governance, when we think about an inclusive governance of social protection, is essential for the region, which means that definitely it should leverage the agencies of the vulnerable people, the communities, and so forth, and many other actors. And I would even say and of course, the civil society, but also the private sector, and so on. It's a whole of society agenda. So, and what is the balance between like navigating informal social protection and formalizing and maybe Rana can say something about that, because this is certainly something of very interesting, and to see how the systems can potentially complement or potentially conflict with each other, including from a conflict prevention perspective. That's personal fruits. That's not UNDP. We are not necessarily venturing into this, but just personal thinking about that, because everybody's mentioning about informal social protection mechanisms, but who is ever really digging into what it means in practice? What are the connections with more formal social protection systems in communities? How do local governments are approaching those informal social protection mechanisms? To which extent are they engaged and so forth? And what are the linkages somehow between these different social protection work streams in countries in the region. I think that's certainly an agenda for research. Over from my side.
Thank you so much. Maybe I can just briefly build on that with one more question, which was just posed by Taimur Anwar. Sorry. And you discussed the formal, informal in light of social protection, but she also raises this question in light of employment. And she asks, do you see any future for employment promotion and social policy in fragile contexts like Afghanistan, where she is currently working, where informal precarious work is dominant and human insecurity is high? And I think in a way you can also again place this within the MENA context, because you face often similar situations. May I invite someone to address this? Please go ahead, Dr. Mahmoud.
I mean, the issue of informal sector the workers and how to bring them into the under the umbrella of social policy and social protection is very crucial in the MENA region because of the size of the informal sector. And also it's applicable to other developing countries, by the way, it's not just MENA. I think broadening the some of the social policy measures with regard to health, for example, or pensions, to the informal sector through some link to contribution-based or some kind of other mechanism is possible. For example, health, for example, you can have some kind of a health insurance that would give coverage at a basic minimum to everybody working in the informal sector on the way towards the citizen-based health system. Basically, what we are talking about here is evolution of rights from people who make a contribution through the social security system to a health or pension or unemployment, etc., to everybody in the country. This is costly. I don't want to deny that. I'm not somebody who has a dream and who lives in dreams. No, I know it's costly, but it is possible, stage by stage, to go and increase the coverage. This has been the history of social policy around the world. Social policy in Germany or in Britain or elsewhere didn't develop overnight for everybody. It was a stage by stage coverage and expansion of existing services to everybody. And this is possible elsewhere, in my view. This is not beyond the budgetary constraints of a lot of countries. The other point I want to make that Natalie discussed was a risk-based approach to social protection, social policy. I do not disagree, I do not disagree with what Natalie said about the importance of risk, taking account of risks. We need to have a handle on risk of different problems in the society in order to provide protection. But I want a risk-based policy which is embedded in a broad universalist social policy approach, not simply everything based on risks. And the reason is this, that if we push the social policy towards risk-based approach, we are going to separate the broad universalist social policy from a targeted social policy. And they will have a two-tier system gradually emerging or consolidating a two-tier system which already exists, like in health or education, because we want to limit the way we want to spend the social, the health budget targeting on the poor. And usually services which are targeted to the poor are going to be poor services, paraphrasing Amartya Sen. So I think we have to be careful about the risk-based approach and try to embed the risk-based approach into a universalist approach in order to get the benefit of both of them, both universal and targeted risk-based approach. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I see Rana also raised her hand, so I would like to invite her.
Yeah, sorry, I won't take long. I appreciate we're running over and we need to finish shortly and wrap up. Just on, if I may, thank you everyone. I think I've really learned a lot. And if I may, just to suggest, because obviously we're going in depth on these discussions, to touch base on Mahmoud's comment there and Natalie's presentation, and then the wider question of integration. I think in some ways there's a halfway house in the life cycle approach, and this idea of welfare systems being attentive to changes over the life course. And that is one way of, I think, potentially combining, the concern with addressing risks that the human security approach perhaps is more about, and Mahmoud's very valid point about universal systems actually being the best basis for resilience of social policy and social protection systems in the future. So I think the life cycle approach, because it has this overview of changes in income and changes in contingencies over the life course, and it's also based on an assumption of the need for a functioning tax-based system. So a state role is involved as well. And I just wanted to mention that I think this may be something to discuss at future events. I know that, certain UN organizations favor the life cycle approach, perhaps specifically UNICEF, maybe for the obvious reason that they focus on children and families. But in some ways, it's a little bit closer, I would say, to the more universal coverage that Mahmoud is calling for and that I would support as well. So in that sense, I would just wanted to contribute those ideas. And then very briefly on, the gentleman's question on Lebanon, I think it would be, if you're still there, so sorry, on capabilities, I think we need to bear in mind that a lot of Arab countries only just began to recognize the existence of poverty in their societies in the 1990s. So simply addressing issues of poverty or extreme poverty or vulnerability has been a challenge, let alone recognizing these much more ambitious concepts of capability. And these are clearly, there's a much wider political and historical context that we can draw upon. But I just wanted to say that I think the progress is still slow towards acknowledging a much wider conceptualization of vulnerabilities, certainly in a country like Lebanon. I'll just stop there. Just mindful of the time, and all our participants. So over to you, Tamara, to wrap things up for us, please. Thank you.
Yes, I will wrap it up. I would, as I saw Natalie also raise her hand, I just ask her to take a few minutes and then I will wrap it up indeed.
Sure, but I thought I should perhaps reply to Mahmoud because, maybe, it was just a bullet point on this multidimensional risk analysis and risk-based approach. The point is, we can see it from a targeting perspective. True, and it's the tendency in the region and formally, but even for this, if we want to be serious about the vulnerabilities and that people are facing, which are not, might be due to the life cycle, but the other things like ecological vulnerabilities and so forth, I think this notion of looking at vulnerabilities from a multidimensional perspective can be very informative, even for targeted protection, social protection. Which is not the case now. Right now, it's only based on poverty, income poverty. So what I'm saying here is that, go beyond income poverty. Look at the spectrum of risk that some communities are facing, and well, it doesn't mean, and that was the second bullet point where we have to rethink the notion of social protection floors in the region and what it means. And when we talk about floors, we talk about universal social protection. So for me, there is no disagreement. From UNEP perspective, we need to think about social protection as a system, as a system that is able to address all the vulnerabilities that all people might be facing. And that might be able also to address the more specific risks that some people are facing. So from that perspective, the two are not conflicting necessarily with each other. That's what I wanted to say. I will stop there because, of course, we could discuss the transitions towards formalization and access with social protection. And so I think it's another webinar, to be honest. Thank you so much again for the opportunity.
I would like to thank our panelists, our esteemed panelists, for their wonderful thoughts and for staying with us for so long. I'm sure that they're all very busy. And I would also like to take a moment to briefly thank the HDCA and my colleagues at the MENASP Network. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it. And I wish you all a wonderful day to everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.